It is the middle of September in the year 2014, and a tiny nation relative to the big states of this world, a nation of 5 million people, has suddenly become the focus of attention all over the globe. We'll consider the international ramifications of what is going on in Scotland later. But a few things need to be made clear. A few explanations are necessary. What is the story of Scotland? How come that what seemed for many, many years, decades, even centuries, to be a calm, stable United Kingdom was suddenly threatened with breakup? Why did this happen, and what is going to be its impact within the United Kingdom, in the larger European community, and in fact different parts of the globe? How is it that so many Scottish people now feel that independence is the only way in which Scotland can realize its full political and cultural potential in the 21st century? So what did happen in the 18th century when Scotland was tricked into the union with England in 1707? Sold down the river, many of its poets thought. And Robert Burns, probably the greatest of all Scottish poets, and there are quite a few to choose from, wrote a wonderful little poem called A Parcel of Rogues. What force or guile could not subdue through many warlike ages is wrought now by a coward few for hireling traitors' wages. The English steel we could disdain, secure in valor's station, but English gold has been our bane, such a parcel of rogues in a nation. Now, the point, of course, that Burns was making was that it was easy to buy off the nobility with a bit of money, with promises, and that the Scottish aristocrats effectively capitulated to the Union. And the weakness in traditional Scottish nationalism lay in its own inability to grasp that identity could not be the only factor in the march to independence. As the late Stephen Maxwell, the very much alive Tom Nairn, and numerous other Scottish intellectuals have pointed out, the Union was a compact between the English bourgeoisie and a weak and desperate Scottish elite. The latter obtained entry into English markets and later to its colonies in North America and Asia. 5 of the British viceroys who ruled India during the days of the British Empire were members of the Scottish gentry. Scottish administrators were a cornerstone of the imperial bureaucracies in Asia and Africa. For the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, the Scottish elites benefited greatly, the subaltern layers less so. As a proportion of population, Scottish deaths exceeded English ones in the inter-imperialist war of 1914-18. There were other downsides as well. 2 processes combined to reawaken Scotland. The Depression of the 1930s left a deep mark on the country, and the end of empire that followed a decade later, after yet another war, created the basis for new thinking. However, the Labour Party that had been born in Scotland, a product of many Scottish politicians and trade unions and workers, had been pledged to Scottish Home Rule. When Labour won a landslide victory in 1945, Clement Attlee's reforms, which included free education, a health service free at the point of production for every single citizen in the country, subsidized house building and housing programs. And it was this combination, the desire to improve socially, the desire to improve their own living standards, that won over Scotland wholesale to Labour, more or less. But it was the Attlee reforms that made any idea of home rule or independence or devolution redundant. Very few in Scotland thought otherwise. So what happened? The new nationalism that is much talked about was essentially the result of a democratic deficit. The bulk of Scotland, for instance, voted against Margaret Thatcher 3 times and felt that they were no longer represented in the English Parliament. Often when one visited Scotland in those days, people would say, "It's none of our business, we voted against all that. We voted against her brutal dismantling of the 1945 Compact." And it was that that shook the Union's foundations. Initially, there were hopes that Labour would be different, but when Tony Blair followed suit, mimicking Thatcher and belittling the Scottish Parliament to be as little more than a local council, the hemorrhaging of Labour votes began. Labour's more enlightened leaders on this question, John Smith and the late Donald Dewar, both important politicians in Scotland, had assumed that devolution would solve the problem. But devolution did not permit the Scottish Parliament the right to levy taxes. And gradually demands began to mount that the Parliament needed more powers. And so it came about that the Scottish National Party changed as lots of Labour supporters, and in some cases a few Labour members of Parliament, joined it. And they began within the Scottish National Party to argue effectively for a social democratic Scotland, not a Thatcherite conservative Scotland. And here was the irony, that whereas the Scottish Tories, the conservative and unionists as they call themselves, were more or less wiped out, their place was taken in Scotland by New Labour. The supporters, the young, eager, on-the-make supporters of Blair and Brown, who thought that all that mattered was money, that modernism or modernity meant becoming like the United States, that what happened in the City of London was much more important than anything going on in Scotland, and Scotland could only benefit. And so the real tartan Tories in the Scottish Parliament today are the visionless careerists of New Labour, incapable of producing a leader with even 1/5 of the qualities that distinguished men like Donald Dewar or John Smith. Small wonder that support for independence was strongest amongst working people. The notion that an independent Scotland would be parochial was not taken seriously by anyone inside Scotland itself. The so-called internationalism of New Labour and its coalition lookalikes essentially meant subordinating the entire British state to the interests of the United States. They made Britain and the United Kingdom a vassal state on Iraq, on Afghanistan, on the gathering of intelligence, on the new wars being planned in different parts of the world. And it was actually felt that an independent Scotland could be far more internationalists and independent and might benefit a great deal from links to both Scandinavia and states in other continents. And then what happened? was a campaign of fear began, based on dodgy statistics, fear-mongering, promoting the failed model of Anglo-globalization as the only alternative possible. And this campaign of fear succeeded, it has to be said, in frightening the more elderly sections of the Scottish population. And as I observed this campaign of fear during the campaign, it became very obvious to me that I had seen this before in another part of Europe. And suddenly it was clear, this is exactly how the European elites had treated Greece when there was a danger that the radical party Syriza might actually win the last general election. Every single European head of state who mattered, the Germans, the French, the British, pleading with the Greek people, don't vote Syriza. If you vote Syriza, your pensions will disappear. If you vote Syriza, there will be no medicines in the shops. You will die. Everything will collapse. The elderly, the pensioners were scared, and they accepted this propaganda, and Syriza lost by a small margin. It is currently way ahead of all the other parties, and were an election to be held tomorrow or the next year, it would win. It would be the largest party in the Greek parliament. People have realized that they were tricked. And that is the same campaign that was waged by all three unionist parties, Labour, Tory, and Lib Dems, supported by a few misguided people on the left, newspaper columnists, etc., in Scotland. Would it work? For the first time, Scotland's sovereignty, honour, and dignity was within the grasp of its own people. For the first time really ever, but certainly since 1707. Would the parcel of rogues triumph again? That became the key question at an early stage of the campaign. I visited Scotland twice, and during 2 trips this summer, witnessed a society that was very much alive, unlike its southern big brother. It was intellectually exhilarating to witness and participate in the serious debates taking place in meeting halls, in kirks, in streets, in pubs and homes. What a contrast to dreary old England, where all three parties and every single media outlet came out against Scottish independence. The No campaign, waged by the coalition, including the so-called Labour opposition, lacked any sense and subtlety. As had been expected, it was based exclusively on fear. And these were the forces of pessimistic conservatism in Scotland. These were the people, the supporters of No, who appeared shallow and parochial. In contrast, the Scottish National Party, and even more the Radical Independence campaign, look at a detached Scotland through international spectacles. Their gaze is fixed on the Norwegian model and beyond. A few months ago, in an open letter to the people of Scotland published by the Herald on Sunday, some of Scandinavia's leading writers and intellectuals encouraged the birth of an independent state, reminding Scots how Norway's break from Sweden in 1905 was also preceded by fear-mongering, but actually improved the quality of life and politics in both countries. The remarkable growth in the pro-independence movement, a direct result of Thatcher's dismantling of the welfare state and Blair Brown's admiration for the same. Till then, the Scots had been prepared to cling on to Labour's coattails, regardless of the corruption and chicanery that had always categorized the Labour machine in Scotland. no longer. Large numbers stopped believing that they could exercise any political self-determination within the existing order. And that was when they began to look beyond the traditional governing parties. And through the campaign, they discovered that they were not alone. How many times did I hear in Scotland, we never realized how important we were, they said to ourselves. People told me there had been no community spirit left in many parts of the big cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh. And we suddenly found ourselves talking to each other again. Debating with our neighbors, debates taking place in each household. And it has been this mass interest in politics, noticed by everyone, that the yes camp is the vigorous camp, that the yes camp is the camp which has reignited politics, made politics popular again. Why? Because people feel that if they move off their backsides and go and campaign and agitate and struggle, they can bring about change. Elsewhere on the continent in England, these activities have led to the growth of the right. Country after country, with the exception of Greece, either the right or passivity. In Scotland, what is now being offered is a national, social, and political self-determination. And the fact is that whatever would happen in the actual vote, even if no one with a small majority, virtually everyone was agreed that things will never be the same again. And many told me, if Scotland wins, what do you think will happen in England? And I used to answer that perhaps the tired lull of English politics would also be disrupted. So Scotland, which has long been a nation, was about to find out whether its citizens wished to become a state or not. The campaign was totally political. The SNP was extremely intelligent in the way they organized the campaign by not pandering to the stereotypes which the English expect, because very few people actually visit Scotland. And the last-minute panic of the politicians was pathetic, grotesque to behold. Politicians who had never even visited Scotland suddenly pouring in. Labour members of Parliament being trained in, sent on the train, 60 members of Parliament in one day to be greeted in Scotland as they marched down Buchanan Street by 2 or 3 young people, one with the megaphone shouting, "Welcome these men and women, people of Scotland. Welcome your masters and mistresses. Welcome those who want to keep us under English yoke forever." So you got a real feeling that the metropolitan elite was totally out of touch, having not taken the campaign too seriously because they were so confident that they were going to sweep through, till they realized that it was getting closer and closer and closer. And one thing that is remarkable is that even in the tiniest communities in the north, the Shetland Islanders, people in the Outer Hebrides, discussions were taking place. Do we want to be part of an independent nation? And many were surprised at the scale of the majorities in these regions voting for yes. An opinion poll, I remember, in the last days of the campaign, which stunned the no-voting camp, which said Glasgow is for independence. And what this meant was that the Labour Party that had ruled parts of Scotland for a long time was breaking up. 30%, 40% of Labour supporters were going to vote for independence. And how was this greeted by the media? here we have a very interesting comparison with what happened in Latin America. That throughout the campaign of the Bolivarians and the social movements against privatization, for a new way of life, for change, 99% of the media in Venezuela, the media in Bolivia, the media in Ecuador was against the new changes and campaigned viciously and brutally against the Bolivarians. But still, they won. Now, what happened here was not so dissimilar. Here, the Unionist left and the Unionist right combined to wage a big campaign against any notion of Scottish independence. Will Hutton, one of the big gurus of the Liberals, writing in the Observer, wrote, "If Britain can't find a way of sticking together, it is the death of the liberal Enlightenment before the atavistic forces of nationalism and ethnicity, a dark omen for the 21st century. Britain will seize as an idea. We will all be diminished." Now, talk like that actually reminds one of the talk we used to hear during the days of the peak of the British Empire, that anyone that mentioned independence for the colonies was greeted with imperial talk of this sort. If you grant independence to India, if you grant independence to Africa, the empire will be diminished and we will be diminished. That was true, of course, because the empire meant a great deal to the identity of Britain or the United Kingdom. And it is possible that the breakup of Britain might diminish people like Will Hutton and others of his ilk, but others might see it as an opportunity to bring about a few changes here. And one of the few columnists in the British press, George Monbiot of The Guardian, unique for that paper, which is a unionist paper, wrote a very fine column 2 days before the vote. "No United Kingdom newspaper," he wrote, "except the Sunday Herald, supports Scottish independence." In The Spectator, Simon Heffer maintains that, addicted to welfare, Scots embraced the something-for-nothing society, objecting to the poll tax because many of them felt that paying taxes ought to be the responsibility of someone else. And then Monbiot quoted Melanie Reid writing this in Murdoch's supposedly most prestigious paper in Britain, The Times. "What spoiled, selfish, childlike fools these Scots are. They simply don't have a clue how lucky they are." How does it affect the political hygiene of journalism that they have to write this rubbish day after day? As Monbiot commented, here is the chronic inability to distinguish between a cause and a person. The referendum is widely portrayed as a vote about Alex Salmond, who is then monstered beyond recognition. A Telegraph editorial compared him to Robert Mugabe. And I could, of course, add that in the Daily Express, they refer to him as a dictator. Someone else the other day was even referring to him as a potential Hitler. I wondered whether that would ever come up, and it did. It was greatly overestimated in relation to South America, where they thought that a consistent media campaign of lies and slanders and half-truths would be sufficient to frighten people. It didn't work in South America. And when I talk about the media, one has to say that in the case of Scotland, it's not only the corporate press owned by the large barons, Murdoch for one, the Barclay twins for another, former pawn merchants and various other worthies who now own daily papers, not to mention the wealthy Russians who own the Independent, they were all for maintaining the Union. What would the Guardian do? A newspaper not owned by anyone except the trust, but it too was caught up in the tide of reaction. Its editorial effectively defended the Union. It gave some space to opposition voices, but its own in-house columnists, with the exception of Monbiot, were all playing from the same hymn sheet. Seamus Milne defending the Union, attacking Alex Salmond as effectively a Tartan Tory and ignoring what Scottish Labour had done to that country and why so many Labour Party supporters had joined the SNP. Young Owen Jones, being trained to be a long-time columnist for the paper, was on a similar line. Steve Bell, one of the most brilliant columnists in Europe, an old friend of mine, usually on the right side, was also caught up in the unionist fervour, portraying Alex Salmond, the SNP leader, as someone who was in Murdoch's pocket. But Murdoch finally rejected Salmond on the grounds that he was too committed to the welfare state, or as Murdoch contemptually put it, welfarism. And for Murdoch, independence couldn't mean being a believer in the welfare state or feeling that it was right to go into the European Union. I don't know what sort of Scotland he wanted. A Scotland which was happily ruled by people loyal to News International, like the United Kingdom had been for a long time, first by Thatcher, then by Blair and Brown, who courted the baron, media baron, going on their knees before him, sucking up to him in the most grotesque ways, till it couldn't be done any longer. And David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, who had hired one of Murdoch's editors as his private PR man, or paid for by the state, this person is currently in prison at Her Majesty's pleasure, being charged with a number of criminal acts. And then Cameron had to do what was considered inconceivable, actually a criminal investigation into the functioning of the Murdoch press. That is effectively what happened. But old media barons never die. They're back again in the corridors of power, haven't been able to play the role they would have liked to play, either in Scotland or in England. So despite the media and despite the role it's played, the Scottish movement, and some have referred to it as a political uprising, for creating a Scotland where you had a proper health service, a free education system, more housing, carried on. And the result, of course, was catastrophic for the British state. The vote in Scotland was close. The Noes did manage to squeak through, but even those who support them know full well that this isn't going to stop here. They have been promised not bags of gold as their predecessors were in 1707, but something called Devomax. In other words, they have been promised by David Cameron and Miliband and Clegg, the leaders of the metropolitan establishment, that they will be allowed to determine more or less anything related to Scotland, of course without affecting defense or foreign policy, which means that they will not be allowed to remove the trident from Scottish soil, which is what they wanted to do. And this, of course, will only stop the tide temporarily, because I think the movement is now so far advanced that if the Scots feel dissatisfied still, which I'm sure they will, in a few years' time, there will be a huge demand for another referendum. And this time they will make it.